they get complete and unequivocal public approval through the law, then they're going to hurt people, and that's exactly what they're trying to do now.
Okay, the arguments have been mounted at many different places, and it's leaked over into the media. Keith Olbermann is on MSNBC. He's been leading the charge, at least in that respect, arguing kind of keep your hands off of the whole gay marriage issue. Here he is making an argument that I will summarize as mind your own business.
If you voted for this proposition or you support those who did or the sentiment they expressed, I have some questions because truly I do not understand. Why does this matter to you? What is it to you? In a time of impermanence and fly-by-night relationships, these people over here want the same chance at permanence and happiness that is your option. They don't want to deny you yours. They don't want to take anything away from you. They want what you want, a chance to be a little less alone in the world.
How would you respond to this, Greg?
Well, I looked carefully at the transcript of what Mr. Olbermann has written, and I appreciate his spirit because at least he's not arguing, yelling, and screaming at the right in this one. But just listen to the first sentence. Truly, I do not understand. Why does this matter to you? Why? What is it to you? And I actually think he's genuinely befuddled, but here's what's odd about that. Apparently, here's a man who is intelligent, educated, articulate, well-read, and one of the most prominent national news broadcasters and commentators in the country. And he is completely mystified about what possible principled concerns anyone could have against same-sex marriage. Has Keith Olbermann not read a single one of the multitude of thoughtful responses regarding the cultural dangers of same-sex marriage that are just a click away on the Internet? What is he doing for research? Now, I realize he probably wouldn't agree with those views if he read them, but notice his complaint. He doesn't even understand them. What does that tell you about a national news commentator who openly confesses that he can't even understand the other side's view, even though it's been articulated by some of the most lucid minds of our generation? That's the first observation. It's an embarrassing admission that he hasn't done any meaningful homework whatsoever. The second thing is that he's saying, and he's talking about the time of impermanence, fly-by-night relationships, that somehow if we don't give these relationships the name marriage and the cultural and proclaim that they are the equivalent of same-sex marriages, somehow we are abandoning all these people to a twilight zone of meaninglessness in their relationships with others, and they can't have satisfying, relationships, or they can't love each other, or somehow we're pushing them out into the cold. Look at, do Susan Sarandon and Tim Robbins have permanence and happiness? As far as I can tell, they do. But they're not married. They have a loving, lifetime commitment to each other that is very public and is very sweet and gracious from all I can tell, and so do tens of thousands of other, even millions of heterosexual people who have chosen to eschew marriage because the paper doesn't mean anything, and rather have what they think is a more meaningful relationship without that so-called piece of paper. Now, I don't approve of that, but I'm simply making the point that there are all kinds of people that seem to do very fine without the name marriage. They can have rich and satisfying relationships. They can interact, be in love with each other. They can have permanence to those relationships. Just because we give them a piece of paper that says marriage on it, this doesn't secure them in permanence. In fact, it has been so impermanent by many people's perspective, a point that Keith Olbermann makes in his own piece, that a lot of people have just abandoned marriage altogether. So then how is it he can be arguing now that unless we give them a particular honorific, in a sense, instead of calling them domestic partnerships, which does secure the relationship in a formal sense before society, we have to call them marriage. And unless we give them that particular terminology, they are being denied permanence, and they are stuck in fly-by-night relationships, and they won't have the happiness that we have access to ourselves. I mean, this is the language that he's using.
All right,
this doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Let's take a break, Greg, and when we come back, we'll get some more of Keith Olbermann, his arguments in favor of gay marriage, or really some more of his rhetorical questions for those who voted to ban gay marriage in California. He makes an analogy between interracial marriage and gay marriage. I'm Todd Wilkin, 1-877-623-MY-IE, or talk back at issuesetc.org.
Talk radio for the thinking Christian. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
Welcome back to Issues, Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. We're responding to same-sex marriage arguments made recently by MSNBC's Keith Olbermann. Greg Koukl of Stand to Reason is our guest. It's Friday, November the 14th. Our email address, talkback@issuesetc.org. Talkback@issuesetc.org. Our call-in number, 1-877-623-MY-IE, 877-623-6943. Greg, let's get your response to Keith Olbermann again. He's making an analogy between interracial marriage and gay marriage.
I keep hearing this term, redefining marriage. If this country hadn't redefined marriage, black people still couldn't marry white people. 16 states had laws on the books which made that illegal in 1967. 1967. The parents of the president-elect of the United States could not have married in nearly one-third of the states of the country their son grew up to lead. But it's worse than that. If this country had not redefined marriage, some black people still couldn't marry other black people. It is one of the most overlooked and cruelest parts of our sad history of slavery. Marriages were not legally recognized if the people were slaves.
Okay, Greg, first of all, he says we redefined marriage when we decriminalized interracial marriage. Is that true?
Yeah, this is the only point in his entire piece where he makes any attempt to address arguments that were offered by the other side. But he doesn't really deal with the point that they're making, not the substantive point. He just attacks this question of redefining. His point, of course, is that marriage has been redefined in the past, and it needed to be. And then he gives the example of blacks getting married. Let me ask you a question just to lead into my point here. There was a time when women didn't have the vote. And a constitutional amendment was passed that made it possible for women's suffrage. And now my question is, well, I should have asked this first question before I mention that. Does everybody understand what voting is? We all know what voting is. Okay. Was voting redefined when more people were allowed to vote than were allowed to vote before? The answer to that is no. Voting wasn't redefined at all. All that was done was a restriction for some people participating in voting that had a very particular definition was lifted so that they could participate. That's the exact same thing we have here. This is not a redefining of marriage, just as if the passage of the women's suffrage was not a redefining of voting. In fact, this is very clear when he points out that 16 states had laws in the books which made interracial marriage illegal. Notice that if 16 states did, 34 states did not. Because they all understood what marriage was. It was the same thing, except for in some states, certain people were excluded from participating. This didn't require a redefinition of marriage. It just simply required a loosening of the restrictions on who could get married. When we take the marriage age, which might be 18 in some states, and we lower it to 16 to include more people who can get married under the law, we're not redefining marriage. We're just simply changing the restrictions that allow people to get married. Now, I'm not at all defending the idea of restricting blacks from being married.